JJ the CPA here. Hope you're doing well. Hey, thanks for tuning in. Wanted to give a update and do a comparison of what's going on with the PPP Flexibility Act. We've got a difference in the Senate and the House. And as we're looking at this, I wanted to cover more in depth though, what would really be unchanged, and then what would be the things that definitely would be affected that we would want to keep our eye on. And so these are just really the major things. So the House has already passed this as of right now. And what the House passed basically unanimously was that the period of covered expenses being allowed would be 24 weeks instead of 8. And then the requirement for the use of the Paycheck Protection Program funds would only be a 60% requirement amount. Now, know this, the House has passed it, Senate hasn't. Of course, it's not law. And most likely what will happen is that the Senate's going to come in and there's going to be now negotiation, because where the Senate's at, and the Senate hasn't voted on anything, but the sentiment in the Senate is that it would be a 16-week covered period versus 8. And then the 75% use for payroll would still be in play. What seems to be possibly some common ground here is that the time period to replace the employees would be 12/31/2020. There's some difficulties that I think that would come out of that in the sense of, that's so far in advance. What if a business was able to recover and then for lots of other reasons didn't have the same number of employees at year end? So there's a big distance there. However, the point of that would be to ease up on that requirement. So I'm going to go through two things related to this. What would be unchanged right now based on what the House has passed, okay, that the proceeds would still not be taxable, but the House did not address this. So expenses by PPP would be non-deductible, meaning that whatever the PPP funds were being used for, whatever those expenses are, that would be something that would be non-deductible still. Also, the definition of FTEs would remain the same. That's full-time employment or full-time employee equivalents, 40 hours. And then the definition of qualified expenses, payroll and non-payroll, at this time, it doesn't seem that there's going to be any new inclusion of the kind of expenses that will be included. And so we're going to have those same definitions based on what we know now. And then the limitation on the owner payroll based on 2019 really looks to be unchanged. So let's now review though what really would be affected, what would be changed if we had more than 8 weeks. Hey, real quick, I'd love it if you'd subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll get back to the video, but I did want to make sure you know, in the body of this, I have a number of playlists that you can jump to talking about the PPP forgiveness, the PPP forgiveness for employers and the self-employed, and then check out my website. I don't ask for any of your information. It's all free for you, but I've got schedules and all kinds of additional documents, copies of what the SBA put out. So go to jjthecpahelp.com. So we know that there's most likely going to be some kind of change given the House was so unanimous in its vote in favor of the PPP Flexibility Act, and the Senate is there saying, yes, we are going to have to provide some flexibility to this. So obviously, what would change, right? Well, we know it's probably not going to be 8 weeks. We're going to either get the 24 or the 12 or somewhere in between. But, and I know this sometimes would seem like an obvious to you, but let's really think through. If it was not for 8 weeks, the expansion is going to lead to full forgiveness being very likely. More time to pay rent and utilities, but remember, there potentially is still going to be that same max of 25% on non-payroll costs. The House is at 40%, maybe it's somewhere in between, but there's still going to be a max that could go towards these expenses. And so for those businesses that got the money and really didn't qualify for it, they didn't have the payroll, they're not replacing the payroll, they're still going to be in that same predicament. But this also, I think, can help for the small businesses out there that maybe don't have a high amount of rent and utilities, a lot of self-employed, that they have a lower amount of costs. This would allow for more forgiveness because there'd be more time to include these expenses, because maybe in an 8-week period, they really even wouldn't hit the max. So that really could benefit the self-employed quite a bit. And then also, what is obvious is going to change, that if it's not 8 weeks, there's more time to spend on payroll. There's more time for employee to be rehired and replaced, and there's more time for businesses to open and use for payroll. And so really with the expansion, or with this flexibility that will come into play, when I say expansion of time, all the fundamentals are going to remain the same. The fundamentals of what qualifies as payroll, the FTEs, what is a qualified expense, what is payroll, what's non-payroll. I think what this does, though, is it really, for the smaller businesses, puts them in a position where they're most likely really going to achieve full forgiveness. And from the beginning, I've said, the goal isn't here is full forgiveness. The goal here is the money's been given to use for these qualified expenses. So use what you need. But we know there's many, many small businesses out there, you might be one that's included, that it's like, well, I can spend all of that money, I just don't have time. I haven't opened back yet. And so we do know that there is the mindset that PPP is supposed to be used regardless if you're open or closed to pay your employees. But we know that the reality is that didn't happen for a number of reasons, either a delay in the PPP funds being provided to the employer, a misunderstanding by the employer, et cetera, et cetera. So point is that I also think that this will lead to potentially some differences in the PPP loan forgiveness application, because if it's going to lead to a forgiveness much easier, I would think that they are not going to change any of the rules. They're not going to change any of the definitions. But when you start now expanding the amount of time, it's going to be so much easier that all of the money would have been spent, but we'll still have to follow the guidelines on it being spent properly, so to speak. And with that being said, by having the expansion, the biggest thing I'll say in closing that will be changed out of this is that for many, they were probably looking to be completing their forgiveness application here coming up in June, or really in July, having to wait until the second quarter payroll reports would be available for those employers. But if we see an expansion, a increase in the amount of time that is considered the covered period, then we're probably looking at the forgiveness applications being put in later in the summer, in the fall, most likely when you have spent all the funds that you have been given on those qualified expenses, then you would be putting in a forgiveness application, which for some could really even go into next year. So stay tuned on this. The one thing to note here is that if you haven't gotten your PPP, there's about $100 billion that's left with the small banks, small credit unions, and you should check out and see if it's now something that you would want to go ahead and get. Maybe you had a little reservations for it because of all the stigma around it, but the amount of time being able to spend the funds on the qualified expenses, I think makes it a whole new ball game. All right, hey, I'd love it if you'd subscribe. And then in the body of this YouTube video, I have put a link to many other playlists related to this and other things that I cover as a CPA. I've got other good information that might be helpful even outside of the PPP world. All right, hey, thanks for tuning in. And then don't you ever forget, you've never met a CPA quite like me. All right, hey, have a great one.